The emergency alarm screamed through the crystal towers of Zentari Prime, calling all council members to an urgent meeting. Representatives from 47 different alien species rushed through the gleaming corridors, their various forms creating a strange parade of colors and shapes. Some flew on delicate wings, others crawled on multiple legs, and a few floated in special suits filled with their home planet's atmosphere. The great council chamber was buzzing with nervous energy. Holographic displays showed red warning symbols across half the galaxy. Ships were fleeing from the outer rim worlds, carrying whatever they could save. Behind them, the darkness spread like a disease, consuming everything in its path. Admiral Vextala stood at the center of the chamber, her blue skin darker than usual with stress. Her 4 arms moved quickly as she pointed at the floating displays around her. The images showed destroyed planets, dead space stations, and the twisted remains of once great fleets. "Honored council members," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. "The situation is far worse than we first believed. The HFY swarm has broken through our 3rd defensive line. They have consumed 17 star systems in the past month alone." A wave of frightened sounds filled the chamber. Some species clicked their mandibles nervously, others made low humming noises, and a few simply stood in shocked silence. Counselor Threndok, whose crystal body reflected the red warning lights, slammed his arm against his speaking platform. "How is this possible? Our combined fleets are the strongest force in galactic history. We have technology these creatures have never seen before." Admiral Vextala's eye stalks drooped with exhaustion. "That is exactly the problem, Counselor. They learn from everything we throw at them. Our energy weapons become useless within hours. Our shield frequencies are copied and turned against us. Every tactic we use, they adapt to and counter." She gestured to a new display showing the HFY themselves. The creatures were a nightmare combination of flesh and machine, constantly changing and evolving. Their ships looked like living things, pulsing with dark energy as they moved through space. "They do not just destroy," the Admiral continued. "They consume. Every ship they capture, every technology they encounter, becomes part of them. They are growing stronger with each victory." In the viewing gallery reserved for the newer species, Ambassador Helen Carter sat quietly in her simple chair. At 73 years old, she had represented Earth at the Galactic Council for 12 years. During that time, she had watched as humanity was treated like children by the older, more advanced species. The humans were the newest members of the Council, admitted only because they had solved the galaxy's food crisis. Earth could grow crops on planets where nothing else would survive. But when it came to important matters like trade, technology, or military affairs, the humans were politely ignored. Helen listened as the council members argued among themselves. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to run. A few suggested trying to negotiate with the HFY, though previous attempts had ended with the diplomatic ships being consumed like everything else. Counselor Zephyr of the Void Runners raised his transparent form. "We must face reality. Our conventional forces cannot stop them. I propose we evacuate the core worlds and establish a new defensive perimeter beyond the Void Nebula." "Evacuate?" Counselor Threndok's crystal form flashed with angry light. "We would be abandoning billions of our people. There must be another way." "What other way?" Admiral Vextala spread all 4 arms in frustration. "We have tried everything. Energy weapons, kinetic bombardment, biological warfare, even quantum disruption. Fields. Nothing works for more than a few battles before they adapt." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with various species suggesting increasingly desperate solutions. Some talked about awakening ancient weapons that had been sealed away for good reason. Others proposed fleeing to unexplored regions of space and starting over. Finally, Helen Carter stood up slowly, Her simple gray uniform, a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial dress of the other ambassadors. Her voice was quiet but clear as she spoke. "If I may, honored counselors, Earth would like to offer assistance." The chamber fell silent for a moment, before a wave of gentle laughter rippled through the assembled delegates. It was not cruel laughter, but the kind adults might make when a child offers to help fix a complicated machine. Admiral HFY Stories turned toward Helen with what might have been amusement. "Ambassador Carter, we appreciate your species' contributions to Galactic agriculture. Perhaps you could coordinate food supplies for the evacuation fleets. That would be very helpful." Helen nodded politely, but there was something in her eyes that would have been familiar to anyone who had served in Earth's military. "Actually, Admiral, I was thinking more along the lines of soldiers." The gentle laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an awkward silence. Several council members exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected suggestion. Councillor Zefter leaned forward, his form shimmering with what his species displayed when trying to be patient. "Ambassador, with all due respect, your species has been at peace for over 200 years. You have no military fleet, no weapons of war, no experience with modern galactic combat." "That is true," Helen agreed calmly. "We have been at peace for a very long time. But before that peace, we had quite a bit of experience with war. And some of those who lived through those times are still with us." She activated a small device from her pocket, and a hologram appeared in the air beside her. The image showed an elderly human man, probably in his 90s, with silver hair and old scars across his weathered face. Despite his age, he stood straight and proud, wearing a uniform covered with ribbons and medals that meant nothing to the alien observers. "This is General Frank Murphy, formerly of the United Earth Defense Force. He has volunteered to address the Council." The hologram flickered slightly as the connection stabilized across the vast distance between Centauri Prime and Earth. When General Murphy spoke, his voice was rough but strong, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded armies decades ago. "Honored counselors," he began, "I know you do not think much of human military capability. That is understandable. We have not fought a war in 2 centuries, and we like it that way. But I have been following your reports about this HFY situation, and I think we might be able to help." Admiral Vextala's forearms crossed in front of her chest. "General, I mean no disrespect to your service, but we are facing an enemy that has destroyed the finest military forces in the galaxy. What could humans possibly do that we have not already tried?" General Murphy's smile was cold and sharp, the expression of a man who had seen too much death and destruction to be impressed by anyone's reputation. "Admiral, you have been fighting these creatures with advanced technology, energy weapons, and shields. Everything they can learn from and adapt to." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We humans have something different to offer. We have experience with what we call primitive warfare. Bullets, explosives, and tactics that do not rely on advanced technology. Things that cannot be easily adapted to or copied." The chamber was completely silent now, with every alien representative focused on the elderly human general speaking from light years away. "I have about 3,000 old soldiers who are getting tired of retirement," Murphy continued. "Veterans from humanity's last wars, men and women who fought when victory meant survival and defeat meant extinction. We may be old, but we remember how to fight." Counselor Threnduck's crystal form pulsed with confused light. "General, you are speaking of elderly humans against a force that has consumed entire fleets. How could 3,000 of your aged warriors possibly make a difference?" General Murphy's expression did not change, but his eyes grew harder. "Counselor, you are about to find out what humans call having nothing left to lose. We do not need fancy weapons or energy shields. Give us transportation to the front lines and access to our old equipment, and we will show you what human soldiers can do when they are properly motivated." The silence stretched on until Admiral Vextala finally spoke. And what, exactly, would motivate your elderly warriors to face certain death against an enemy that has defeated our best forces? The same thing that has motivated human soldiers for thousands of years, Murphy replied simply. The knowledge that if we do not fight, innocent people will die. That if we do not stand up to bullies, they will keep taking whatever they want. That sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to sacrifice everything for it. Ambassador Carter stepped forward slightly. The General speaks for all of humanity in this matter. We are offering our service to the Galactic Council, not as a desperate gesture, but as fellow citizens of this galaxy who refuse to abandon their neighbors in their time of need. The council chamber remained silent as the alien representatives tried to process what they had just heard. The idea that the galaxy's newest and seemingly weakest species would volunteer to face their greatest threat was almost incomprehensible. The transport ship Stellar Dawn had never carried passengers like these before. Built for moving cargo between star systems, its holds had been quickly fitted with basic sleeping quarters and meeting spaces. As the ship traveled toward the outer rim territories, strange sounds echoed through its corridors. The steady rhythm of boots marching in formation, voices singing old military songs, and the distinctive clicking sound of weapons being cleaned and checked. Captain Lucy Hayes moved through the ship with surprising speed for someone her age. At 81, she walked with the help of an artificial leg, a reminder of the Battle of Kepler Station from 60 years ago. But the mechanical limb barely slowed her down as she inspected every section of the ship, checking on the 3,000 volunteers who had answered General Murphy's call. These were not the humans the galaxy knew. The aliens had only seen Earth's farmers, scientists, and diplomats. They had never met the generation that remembered when humanity fought wars among the stars, when survival meant being willing to kill or die for your people. In the main cargo hold, now converted into a briefing room, Lucy found Colonel Pete Anderson addressing a group of soldiers. At 93, he was one of the oldest people on the ship, but his voice still carried the authority that had once commanded entire divisions in humanity's last great conflicts. Listen up, people, he said, standing straight despite his age. I know most of you have not held a rifle in 50 years, but your body remembers what your mind might have forgotten. We are not here to prove anything to the aliens. We are here because there is work that needs doing, and we are the only ones left who know how to do it. The soldiers gathered around him ranged in age from 70 to over 100. Some moved with artificial joints replacing parts worn out by decades of hard living. Others bore scars from battles fought when the galaxy was younger and humanity was still learning its place among the stars. But all of them carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of professional warriors. These were the survivors of humanity's violent past, the generation that had fought to unite Earth's scattered colonies, and then chosen to lay down their weapons when peace was finally achieved. For 2 centuries, they had been farmers, teachers, and grandparents. Now they were soldiers again. Sergeant Major Rita Clark stood up from where she had been checking her equipment. At 85, she was a compact woman with steel gray hair and hands that moved with practiced efficiency over her gear. Colonel, what exactly is our mission when we reach the Nexus station? The Council seems to think we are going on some kind of suicide run. Colonel Anderson smiled, but there was no humor in it. Rita, when has that ever stopped us before? Our mission is simple. We hold the Nexus station until all civilians can evacuate safely. The Kethver are expecting another conventional response from the galaxy's military forces. He gestured toward the equipment cases being distributed around the room. What they are not expecting is 3,000 humans with kinetic weapons, chemical explosives, and a complete willingness to die rather than let innocent people be hurt. The equipment cases contained weapons that most of the galaxy had forgotten existed. While other species had moved to energy-based warfare centuries ago, the humans had kept their old projectile weapons in storage. Rifles that fired metal bullets, grenades filled with chemical explosives, and other tools of what the aliens considered primitive warfare. Dr. Greg Williams looked up from the medical supplies he was organizing. At 79, he had served as a military doctor in 3 different conflicts before retiring to teach medicine on Earth. Pete, I have been reading the alien reports about HFY combat capabilities. They can adapt to energy weapons within hours. Their bio-armor adjusts to different shield frequencies, and they can heal from most types of damage we have seen other species use. And that is exactly why we brought bullets, Doc, Anderson replied, opening one of the weapon cases. Inside were rows of traditional kinetic rifles, their metal surfaces worn smooth by decades of use. Let us see them try to adapt to a chunk of depleted uranium moving at 3,000 meters per second. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. Captain Ben Rogers picked up one of the rifles and hefted it with satisfaction. At 98 years old, he was one of the few people on the ship who had actually fought against alien enemies before, during humanity's early expansion into space. Feels good to hold real steel again. When do we reach our destination? 6 hours, Anderson answered. Use the time to get familiar with your weapons again and study the station blueprints. The HFY will arrive 12 hours after we do. And we need to be ready to show them what human soldiers can accomplish when they have nothing left to lose. As the ship continued its journey, messages began arriving from Earth. Families were saying goodbye to grandparents and great-grandparents who might never come home. Old friends wished each other luck and promised to meet again in whatever came after death. The younger generation sent messages of amazement and pride, hardly believing that their elderly relatives were heading off to war one final time. Lieutenant Colonel Susan Davis, at 76, the youngest senior officer on the ship, read some of these messages aloud to boost morale. Here is one from the Academy on Mars, she announced. It says, to the veterans heading to the front lines, you taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. Show the galaxy what it means to be human. The soldiers listening to her smiled grimly. They had not chosen this mission for glory or recognition. Most of them had children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren living peaceful lives throughout human space. They were fighting so those younger generations would never have to know the horror of war. In another part of the ship, Major Tony Clark worked with a team of engineers to modify their equipment for the upcoming battle. The Nexus station had been built by aliens with corridors and rooms designed for species very different from humans. They needed to adapt their tactics to fight in an environment that had not been made for their kind of warfare. The good news, Tony explained to his team, is that most alien species are larger than us. The corridors will give us room to move. The bad news is that the HFY are also larger than us, and they are designed for close combat. Sergeant Rita Clark, who had been listening to the briefing, spoke up. Major, we have been fighting larger enemies our entire military careers. Size means nothing if you know where to aim. The confidence in her voice spread through the group. These soldiers had faced impossible odds before and survived. They had fought when defeat meant not just death, but the end of human civilization. They had won those battles through superior tactics, better training, and the absolute refusal to give up. As the stellar dawn approached the Nexus station, the mood on the ship began to change. The casual conversations and shared memories gave way to the focused quiet that comes before battle. Soldiers checked their weapons one final time, reviewed their assignments, and made peace with whatever fate awaited them. Colonel Anderson called a final meeting in the main briefing room. Every soldier who could fit into the space gathered to hear his words. Those who could not find room listened over the ship's communication system. People, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ship. In a few hours we will dock at the Nexus station. The aliens there are going to be surprised to see us. They are expecting to die fighting a hopeless battle against an enemy they cannot defeat." He paused, looking out at the faces around him. These were his people, soldiers who had followed him through decades of peace, and now into what might be their final battle. "We are going to show them something different. We are going to show them that humans do not know how to quit. We are going to hold that station until every civilian is safely away, no matter what it costs us." The soldiers nodded in understanding. They had known from the beginning that this was likely a one-way mission. But they had also known that some things were worth dying for. "The galaxy thinks we are too old, too weak, too primitive to make a difference," Anderson continued. "They are about to learn that they have never seen humans fight a real war. We are not going there to win. We are going there to buy time with our lives so that innocent people can live." Captain Hayes stood up, leaning on her artificial leg. "Colonel, what do we tell the aliens when they ask why we came?" Anderson smiled, and this time there was warmth in it. "We tell them the truth, Lucy. We tell them that we are old, we are tired, and we have nothing left to prove to anyone. But we also tell them that we are human, and humans do not abandon their friends." The ship's intercom crackled to life with the pilot's voice. "All passengers, prepare for arrival at Nexus Station. Docking in 30 minutes. The old soldiers began moving toward their equipment, their movements efficient, despite their age. They had spent their youth learning how to fight, their middle years keeping the peace, and now they would spend their final years proving that some lessons are never forgotten. As the Nexus Station grew larger on the ship's view screens, 3,000 elderly humans prepared to step into legend. They were no longer the grandparents and great-grandparents who had boarded the ship on Earth. They were soldiers again, ready to show the galaxy what that word truly meant. The Nexus Station hung in the darkness of space like a giant metal flower, its 5 arms stretching out into the void. Massive evacuation ships moved slowly around it, loading refugees from a dozen different worlds. The alien defenders were already pulling back to safer positions, convinced that the station would fall within hours once the HFY arrived. Colonel Pete Anderson stood in the station's command center, studying the tactical displays alongside Commander Zell Thara, the station's commanding officer. The alien's feathered crest lay flat against her skull, which her species did when they were extremely worried or afraid. "Colonel Anderson," Commander Zell Thara said, her voice shaking slightly, "I must ask you to reconsider this plan. My engineers have calculated that the HFY will break through our outer defenses within minutes of their arrival. Your people should evacuate with the others." Anderson did not look up from the displays showing the station's layout. "Commander, with all respect, your engineers have never seen humans fight. We are staying." The command center's doors opened, and Captain Lucy Hayes entered, her artificial leg clicking against the metal floor. Despite being 81 years old and walking with difficulty, she moved with the confidence of someone who had survived battles that would have broken younger soldiers. "Pete," she said, "we have finished setting up the outer sections. Explosive charges at every important junction, overlapping fields of fire covering all approaches, and enough ammunition to hold off an army. The boys and girls are in position and ready." Through the command center's large windows, the first signs of the enemy appeared. Dark shapes emerged from hyperspace, their biomechanical forms pulsing with evil-looking energy. The HFY fleet was enormous, easily 10 times larger than the remaining defense forces around the station. Sergeant Major Rita Clark's voice came through the communication system, calm and professional despite what everyone knew was coming. "All units, this is Command Post Alpha. Enemy contact in 5 minutes. Remember, we are not trying to win this war. We are buying time for people to escape. Make every shot count and make them pay for every meter they take." The HFY ships moved through space with frightening grace, their adaptive hulls already changing to counter the energy signatures of the station's defensive weapons. Within minutes, the first wave of boarding pods launched from the enemy ships, carrying creatures designed specifically for tearing through metal and flesh. Anderson picked up his rifle, a weapon that had seen service in 3 different wars over the past 70 years. The metal was worn smooth in places where his hands had gripped it during countless battles. "Commander, I suggest you and your people get to the evacuation ships. This place is about to become very dangerous." The first HFY broke through the station's outer hull in Section C, their claws and bioweapons making quick work of the reinforced metal. They poured through the breach like a living flood, expecting to find the same kind of resistance they had encountered from other species. Energy weapons they could adapt to, tactics they had already learned to counter, enemies who would break and run when the fighting got too intense. Instead, they found Sergeant Rita Clark and her squad waiting in the corridor beyond the breach. "Well, hello there, Ooglies," Rita said quietly, raising her rifle to her shoulder. "Welcome to the neighborhood." The gunfire that erupted was unlike anything the HFY had experienced in their long campaign across the galaxy. The human weapons fired solid metal projectiles that punched through their bio-armor with devastating effect. The bullets moved too fast to be stopped by their adaptive defenses, hitting with kinetic force that their healing abilities could not immediately counter. But it was not just the weapons that surprised the HFY. It was the humans themselves. These elderly soldiers fought with a cold, calculated ferocity that seemed to ignore pain, fear, and the possibility of death. They had lived long lives, raised families, and seen peace in their time. Now they were ready to die so others could live. Captain Ben Rogers and his team held the central hub of the station, their position fortified with furniture, metal plates, and 60 years of combat experience. When the HFY tried to overwhelm them with sheer numbers, they found themselves walking into carefully prepared killing zones, where every angle was covered and every shot was placed with surgical precision. "Contact front," Rogers shouted over the noise of gunfire. His voice was still strong despite his 98 years. "Rita, they are trying to go around us through Section B." "Already on it, Ben." Clark's voice carried both exhaustion and grim satisfaction. "These things really do not like bullets much, do they?" The HFY had evolved to fight enemies who used energy weapons and advanced technology. Their bio-armor could adapt to laser frequencies and plasma temperatures. Their healing abilities could counter most forms of energy damage. But they had never faced an enemy that simply shot chunks of metal at high speed. Dr. Greg Williams worked frantically in the makeshift medical station he had set up in one of the station's cafeterias. Around him, wounded soldiers lay on tables while alien blood and human sweat mixed on the floor. "Pete," he called out to Colonel Anderson over the communication system, "we need more time. I have got 15 people here who need serious medical attention." "Then we will give it to them, Doc," Anderson replied between bursts of gunfire as he led a counterattack against HFY forces trying to reach the station's power core. "All units, this is command. Execute Phase 2 now." Throughout the station's outer sections, explosive charges detonated in carefully planned sequences. Entire corridors collapsed, sealing off areas and trapping HFY forces in compartments that became their tombs. The humans had turned the station into a deadly maze, using their knowledge of three-dimensional warfare to create defensive positions that the enemy could not predict or counter. The HFY had expected to face the same kind of enemy they had fought throughout their campaign. Aliens who relied on technology, who fought from a distance with energy weapons, who retreated when the battle turned against them. Instead, they found humans who seemed willing to fight hand-to-hand with knives when their ammunition ran low. Major Tony Clark held a position near the station's engineering section with only 12 soldiers. When a group of HFY managed to break through their defensive line, he pulled the pin from a grenade and charged directly at them. The explosion killed him and 5 enemy soldiers, but it also bought his remaining troops time to establish a new defensive position. Hours passed in a blur of violence, smoke, and the constant noise of gunfire. The human soldiers were taking casualties, but they were making the HFY pay heavily for every advance. Bodies of both species littered the corridors, and the air recycling system struggled to clear the smoke from burning equipment and exploded. Charges. Commander Zelthara, still in the command center despite Anderson's suggestion that she evacuate, watched the tactical displays with growing amazement. "Colonel, this is impossible. My tactical computers show that your forces should have been overrun hours ago." Anderson wiped blood from a cut on his forehead and checked his ammunition. "Commander, your computers do not understand what they are seeing. They are programmed to analyze normal military tactics. What we are doing here is not normal." "What do you mean?" "We are not fighting to win," Anderson explained. "We are fighting to lose as slowly as possible. Every minute we hold them here is another minute for the evacuation ships to get further away. We will all die here, but that is acceptable if it means the civilians escape." The concept was completely foreign to the HFY. In their species, survival was the highest priority. They could not understand an enemy that was willing to sacrifice itself for strangers. This confusion disrupted their usual tactics and made them hesitate at crucial moments. "Sergeant," Major Clark's voice came over the communication system again, but this time she sounded tired. "All units, we are running low on ammunition in sections. Conserve your shots and prepare for close combat." The old soldiers had known this moment would come. They drew knives, grabbed improvised weapons, and prepared to continue fighting even when their bullets ran out. Some were already engaging the HFY in hand-to-hand combat, using techniques learned in wars fought decades ago. Captain Hayes, defending the reactor section with a force reduced to 20 soldiers, spoke into her communicator. "Pete, I hate to tell you this, but we have maybe 1 hour of ammunition left at current consumption rates." "Then we make it last, Lucy," Anderson replied. "And when it runs out, we use whatever else we can find." Dr. Williams, still working to save wounded soldiers, looked up from his medical table. "Colonel, I have to tell you, we are running out of medical supplies almost as fast as ammunition. But these people keep fighting, even when they should be unconscious from blood loss." The truth was that the old soldiers were running on something more powerful than medical supplies or ammunition. They were fighting for their children and grandchildren, for the peaceful worlds they had helped create, and for the idea that some things were worth dying for. As the battle continued to rage through the station's corridors, something unexpected began to happen. The Galactic Council chamber on Centauri Prime had never been so quiet. Every alien representative sat in stunned silence, watching the live feeds from Nexus Station on the massive display screens. What had started as a routine evacuation operation had become something none of them had thought possible. Admiral Vestala stood before the tactical displays, her 4 arms trembling as she tried to process what she was seeing. The readings made no sense according to everything she knew about warfare. This cannot be happening. The HFY should have taken the station hours ago. Counselor Threndock leaned forward, his crystal body reflecting the light from the battle displays. "Ambassador Carter, what exactly are your people doing down there?" Helen Carter remained calm in her seat, though pride shone clearly in her old eyes. "What they have always done best, Counselor. Their duty." On the screens, the battle continued to rage through every corridor of Nexus Station. The human soldiers, now reduced to fewer than 2,000, had turned the entire facility into a fortress of death. Every room was a trap, every hallway a killing ground. The HFY, for the first time in their campaign across the galaxy, had met an enemy that simply refused to break. In the station's command center, Colonel Pete Anderson coordinated the defense while monitoring the evacuation progress. His uniform was torn and stained with blood, both his own and that of enemies he had killed in close combat. Exhaustion lined his 93-year-old face, but his voice remained steady over the communication system. "All stations, this is command. Evacuation Fleet Delta has cleared the gravity well. We have 4 more hours until all civilian ships are safely away." Captain Lucy Hayes, now commanding the defense of the reactor section, with only 18 soldiers remaining, responded immediately. "Understood, Pete. We have maybe 2 hours of ammunition left if we keep shooting at this rate." "Then we stretch it, Lucy. Fire only when you have clear shots and make every bullet count." The HFY had begun changing their tactics, but they found themselves facing something their evolutionary programming had never prepared them for. The humans were not fighting just to survive or to win territory. They were fighting to ensure that others could escape, willing to die for people they had never met and would never see again. This concept of self-sacrifice for strangers was so foreign to the HFY way of thinking that they could not develop an effective strategy to counter it. Their biomechanical minds were designed to understand conquest, adaptation, and survival, but not the idea that someone would choose death over abandoning their duty. Sergeant Major Rita Clark's position in Section D had been overrun twice, but she and her remaining soldiers had retaken it both times, through sheer determination and superior knowledge of human warfare tactics. "Ben, I need covering fire for a supply run. We are down to our last magazines." Captain Ben Rogers, holding the central hub with a force reduced to 23 soldiers, checked his own ammunition supply. "Rita, we are all running low, but there is a weapons cache in Section A if you can fight your way there." "On my way." Clark led her small team in a fighting withdrawal through corridors filled with the bodies of both species, moving with the fluid efficiency of soldiers who had fought together for decades and knew each other's every move. The HFY pressed their attack harder, sensing that the human defenders were weakening. But every time they thought they had broken through, they encountered another defensive line, another group of elderly soldiers who seemed to appear from nowhere with weapons ready. Dr. Greg Williams continued to perform miracles in his makeshift medical station, treating wounds that should have been fatal without proper hospital equipment. Around him, soldiers who should have been unconscious from blood loss continued to fight, held upright by determination and the knowledge that others were depending on them. Colonel Williams called out over the communication system, "I have to tell you, we are running out of medical supplies almost as fast as ammunition. But these people keep fighting, even when they should be dead." Anderson's response was interrupted by an urgent transmission from the evacuation fleet. "Nexus Station, this is Transport Command. We are detecting massive HFY reinforcements approaching your position. Estimated time of arrival, 90 minutes. The news sent a chill through the human defenders. They had been barely holding against the initial assault force. Fresh enemy troops would overwhelm their depleted numbers within minutes of arrival. "All units, this is command." Anderson's voice carried clearly through the station. "Listen carefully, people. We have company coming, and it is going to be a hard fight. But look at what we have accomplished here today. 30,000 civilians are alive and safe because of what we have done." Captain Hayes managed a tired laugh over the communication channel. "Pete, you always were too sentimental for your own. Good. That is why you married me, Lucy." The revelation that the 2 senior officers were husband and wife sent a wave of warmth through the communication network. These were not just soldiers following orders. They were families, friends, and lovers who had chosen to face death together, rather than let innocent people suffer. As the HFY reinforcements approached through hyperspace, something completely unexpected began to happen. The alien fleets that had been retreating from the outer rim started to turn around. Ship after ship from various species began forming up into a defensive formation around the Nexus Station. Admiral Vex Tallis' voice came through the communication system, and For the first time since the crisis began, she sounded hopeful. Nexus Station, this is Admiral Vex Tala commanding the Combined Defense Fleet. We are moving to support your position. Anderson paused in his tactical preparations, surprised by the transmission. Admiral, with all respect, you should continue. The evacuation. We can handle things here. Colonel Anderson, I have been fighting wars for 60 years, and I have never seen courage like what your people are showing. The least we can do is stand with you. The communication channels filled with voices as ships from dozens of species announced their intention to join the defense. The Hegemony Alliance sent their fastest cruisers. The Void Runners contributed. Their stealth ships. Even species that had been neutral in galactic conflicts were sending vessels to help. As the reinforcement fleet took position around the station, representatives from many species began volunteering to join the ground defense. The old human soldiers had reminded the galaxy what real courage looked like, and now other species were ready to learn from their example. Commander Zelthara, still in the command center despite multiple opportunities to evacuate, watched the tactical displays with growing amazement. Colonel, something is happening to the Kethver formations. They seem to be slowing their advance. Anderson looked at the displays and saw what she meant. The enemy forces were still attacking, but with less coordination than before. Their usual fluid movements had become hesitant, uncertain. They do not understand what they are seeing, Anderson realized. Their entire species is built around the idea of adaptation and survival. They cannot comprehend an enemy that chooses to die rather than retreat. Dr. Williams looked up from treating a wounded soldier. Pete, I think there is something else happening here. I have been monitoring the alien communication frequencies, and the Kethver are actually trying to communicate with us. This was unprecedented. Throughout their campaign across the galaxy, the Kethver had never attempted communication with their enemies. They had simply consumed everything in their path, learning and adapting as they went. Put it through, Anderson ordered, the communication. That came through was unlike anything the humans had heard before. It was not words, but a series of complex tones and harmonics that the station's translation system struggled to interpret. Finally, a rough translation appeared on the command center screens. Why do you choose death when escape is possible? Why do you fight for those who are not your offspring? This behavior pattern is unknown to us. Anderson thought for a moment before responding. We fight because it is the right thing to do. We die so that others may live. That is what makes us human. The response from the Kethver came faster this time. This concept is difficult to process. You gain nothing from this sacrifice. Your genetic material will not survive. Your species receives no territorial advantage. You are right, Anderson replied. We gain nothing except the knowledge that we did our duty. Sometimes that is enough. There was a long pause before the next Kethver transmission. We require time to analyze this new behavioral pattern. Combat operations will continue, but at reduced intensity while we process this information. The change was immediate and noticeable. The Kethver attacks became less fierce, more cautious. It was as if the entire enemy force had been thrown into confusion by the simple concept of self-sacrifice for strangers. Captain Hayes's voice came over the communication system, filled with wonder. Pete, are you seeing this? They are actually pulling back from some positions. I see it, Lucy. Keep your people ready, but do not advance. Let them think about what they have learned. As the combined fleet of alien reinforcements took up defensive positions around the station, the old human soldiers found themselves in a situation they had never expected. The Second Battle of Nexus Station, as historians would later call it, lasted another 18 hours. The combined fleet of human defenders and alien reinforcements met the Kethver Armada in a battle that would be studied in military schools. Across the galaxy for generations to come, the human soldiers, now numbering fewer than 800, continued to hold the station while the alien fleets engaged the enemy in space. Their tactics had changed during the long fight, incorporating lessons learned from decades of peace that the galactic military had forgotten. They no longer fought like young warriors seeking glory, but like old guardians protecting their families. Colonel Pete Anderson, wounded but still commanding from the station's control center, watched the tactical displays as the tide of battle slowly began to turn. The HFY, faced with enemies who refused to follow any predicted patterns, were making mistakes for the first time in their campaign. All stations, this is command. Enemy forces are beginning to pull back from the outer sectors. Maintain pressure but save your ammunition. Captain Lucy Hayes, leading the final push to clear the reactor section, responded with obvious exhaustion in her voice. Pete, I think we might actually survive this thing. The real breakthrough came when Sergeant Major Rita Clark, leading a small reconnaissance team through the station's lower levels, discovered something that changed everything. The HFY were not just invaders trying to conquer the galaxy. They were refugees running away from something even worse that had consumed their original home. Colonel, you need to see this immediately, Clark reported from deep within the station's alien-occupied sections. They have got young ones down here, hundreds of them. This is not an invasion force. This is an evacuation. The revelation transformed the entire conflict. Dr. Greg Williams, despite his exhaustion and dwindling medical supplies, immediately began working with the station's alien medical staff to provide aid to the HFY juveniles. The sight of elderly human soldiers sharing their food and medicine with enemy children would become one of the most famous images in galactic history. Within hours, a ceasefire was established. The HFY adults, faced with enemies who showed mercy to their young, began to communicate through the station's translation systems. The real threat, they revealed, was something called the Void Devourers. These were entities that consumed entire star systems and left nothing but empty space behind them. The HFY had been fleeing from these creatures for decades, consuming other civilizations not out of evil intent, but out of desperate need for resources to keep running. They had learned to adapt and evolve because it was the only way to stay ahead of the Void Devours. Ambassador, now aboard the Nexus station after arriving with the reinforcement fleet, worked alongside the human military commanders to establish meaningful dialogue between the species. The old soldiers, having proven their worth in battle, now demonstrated their value as peacekeepers and negotiators. The Void Devourers destroyed our original worlds, the HFY leader explained through the translation system. We have been running for 300 of your years. We consume other civilizations because we must have resources to stay ahead of them. We do not enjoy this, but we see no alternative. Colonel Anderson, sitting across from the alien leader despite his wounds, spoke with the same calm authority he had used throughout the battle. There is always an alternative. The question is whether we have the courage to find it together. The Galactic Council, meeting an emergency session while the negotiations continued, formally recognized humanity as a major military power and offered them a permanent seat on the Defense Committee. The vote was unanimous, something that had never happened in Council history. General Frank Murphy, his holographic form appearing before the assembled Council from Earth, delivered the human response with characteristic directness. Counselors, we appreciate the recognition, but we are not interested in conquest or control. We just want to make sure that when the next threat comes, we are all ready to face it together. The human soldiers who survived the Battle of Nexus Station became legends throughout the galaxy. Their tactics were studied by military academies, their courage was celebrated in songs and stories, and their sacrifice was honored by species that had never heard of Earth before the battle. Captain Lucy Hayes and Colonel Pete Anderson, both recovering from their wounds in the station's medical bay, received visitors from dozens of worlds. The elderly couple, still wearing their battle-damaged uniforms, were offered medals and honors from species they could not even pronounce the names of. "You know, Pete," Lucy said as she watched another group of alien dignitaries file through their room, "I thought retirement was supposed to be boring." "It was getting pretty dull," Anderson agreed with a smile. "But I think we might have started something important here." They had indeed started something significant. The Battle of Nexus Station marked the beginning of the first galactic defense alliance, with human military doctrine forming the backbone of a new approach to galactic security. The old soldiers had not only saved the evacuation, they had changed the nature of warfare itself. The alliance that formed included not just the traditional galactic powers, but also the Kethver, who brought their adaptive technologies and knowledge of the Void Devourers. Working together, the combined forces began developing new strategies and weapons to face the real threat approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge. 6 months later, the Void Devourers arrived at the Outer Rim. They were met not by the divided retreating forces they had encountered in other galaxies, but by a united coalition of species trained in human tactical doctrine and led by officers who had learned their skills from the veterans of Nexus Station. War that followed lasted 3 years and tested every species in the galaxy. But it ended in victory for the Galactic Alliance, proving that cooperation and sacrifice could overcome even the most terrible enemies. The memorial erected at Nexus Station bore a simple inscription in dozens of languages, in memory of those who stood when standing seemed impossible, fought when fighting seemed hopeless, and proved that the measure of a warrior is not in victory, but in the willingness to face defeat for the sake of others. The old human soldiers had taught the galaxy what it meant to be truly human, and the lesson would never be forgotten. Schools throughout known space taught children about the Battle of Nexus Station, where 3,000 elderly humans showed that age, technology, and numbers meant nothing compared to courage and determination. Years later, when young soldiers from many species faced impossible odds, they would remember the story of the old humans who refused to quit. They would think of Colonel Anderson and Captain Hayes, of Sergeant Major Clark and Dr. Williams, and all the others who had chosen duty over safety. The galaxy had learned that humans were not just good farmers or peaceful diplomats. They were a species that would stand and fight when others needed protection, even when the cost was everything they had. This knowledge changed how every other species viewed not just humans, but themselves. The peaceful retirement colonies throughout human space became training grounds where alien military officers came to learn from the surviving veterans. The old soldiers, now truly in their final years, shared their knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn. The secret, Colonel Anderson would tell his alien students, is not in the weapons you carry or the technology you use. It is in understanding what you are fighting for. When you know that your sacrifice will save others, defeat becomes just another obstacle to overcome. The transformation was complete. Humanity had entered the galactic community as farmers and diplomats, dismissed as weak and primitive. They had proven themselves as warriors and leaders, respected by every species in known space. But perhaps most importantly, they had shown that the true strength of any civilization lay not in its weapons or technology, but in the willingness of its people to sacrifice for others. The old human soldiers had stepped onto the battlefield when the galaxy needed them most, and in doing so, they had saved not just thousands of lives, but the very idea of what it meant to be civilized. The galaxy would never again underestimate the species that produced such warriors, and humanity would never again be seen as anything less than equal partners in the community of worlds. The old soldiers had earned their place in history, and their legacy would inspire countless generations to come.